May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your eyes, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Good morning, everyone. So this is the last Sunday after Pentecost. And since 1925, it has also been celebrated as Christ the King's Sunday. So before I share with you my thoughts about this morning's gospel reading, I'd like to reflect on the meaning and origin of this day. And to be honest, I really hadn't thought much about Christ the King's Sunday until I read an article in the publication Christian Century earlier this month. This celebration came into being in 1925 when Pope Pius XI instituted it to combat the evil and sin that was overtaking the world, a world that had been ravaged by the First World War. And to quote the article, a world that had begun to bow down before the lords of exploitative consumerism, nationalism, secularism, and new forms of injustice. The Pope hoped that with the establishment of Christ the King's Sunday, the direction of the world could be turned around toward reconciliation through our King of Peace. A wonderful objective that was a very tall order in face of some of the events that were taking place at that time. For example, Mussolini had dissolved the Italian parliament and became a dictator. Adolf Hitler resurrected his political party and his Mein Kampf was published. 40,000 members of the KKK marched in Washington, D.C. At that time, the Klan had 5 million members across the U.S. And immigration to the U.S. from Italy dropped almost 90%, and immigration from Britain dropped 53%. Feels like history is repeating itself some 95 years later, doesn't it? The Pope's hope was to refocus the concern of the church on Jesus and his actions and teachings about service, self-sacrifice, and revolutionary action. He had hoped that by identifying Jesus as the opposite of the direction of the world at that time and celebrating him as king, the church and the world would find their way to a more Christ-like character. Well, it's quite easy to see by the state of the world then and today that what seemed like a good idea simply hasn't quite worked out. The desire to replace evil and sin with a compassionate world, as described by Jesus in this morning's gospel reading, is not easy. But it's not impossible if we each take on the responsibility of living lives of love and compassion. This reading is one of my favorite passages for a number of reasons. First of all, it's not a parable. It's a descriptive narrative that clearly tells us how we are to be judged at the end of time. Secondly, I love the inclusiveness of the judgment. Notice that it says, all nations.
Karen, you're muted.
Thank you. Secondly, I love the inclusiveness of the judgment. Notice that it says all nations will be gathered before him, not just Jews, Gentiles, or followers of Christ, but all the nations. A universal judgment where Jesus, the King, will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. I also love that the basis of the King's judgment is not on how many hours we spend in church, the extent of our prayer life, or the amount of our charitable contributions. Not that these aren't important, they are, but here the judgment is based on how we treat others during our lifetime, how we respond when we see somebody in need, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner. We are saved by how we treat others. We are justified by our works and actions that are driven by a deep understanding of the just treatment of the least of these. It also implies the importance of the actions we take against the injustice being experienced by those considered to be the least of these, like immigrants and refugees, the homeless and the hungry. In the reading, those who did care for others by showing compassion and understanding were judged worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Those who didn't were met with another fate. But I think this goes a little further than just actions and goes to the motivation behind them. When Jesus identified those who were righteous because they did care for the least of these, they seemed surprised by it and responded, but when did we do these things? It's as if when they saw and cared for others in need, for the least of these, it was a natural response for them to do so, like a second nature. Doing so not because it would get them into heaven, but doing so because it is how God meant for us to care for each other, to be compassionate and to love each other in the here and now. Love thy neighbor as thyself, especially those who are in need. On the other hand, we have the accursed, those who did nothing for the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, or the prisoner. They also seemed surprised at their verdict, indicated that they basically didn't remember having seen those in need, and most likely they didn't. They saw right past those in need, being far more concerned with their own welfare and needs. And that is what Jesus the King is judging against: blindness to those who are in need, to the injustice that exists in the world. He was establishing a new social structure based on the God-given dignity of every human being, and a final judgment based solely on our treatment of others. Do we see the face of Christ in the least of these that we pass every day? Do we reach out to help and to love, or do we just look right past them? Sometimes we may find ourselves among the least of these. There are times when each of us may have been in need, when we were hungry or thirsty or sick or the stranger. And at those times, we probably experienced what it felt like to be seen and loved by others. And we might have experienced what it felt like when others saw right past us. We experienced what it was like to be met by a righteous sheep as well as by an accursed goat. Most of us can relate to being on both sides as well. This love thy neighbor thing goes both ways, and Jesus as King places himself among the least of these as well as with the righteous. I'd like to share with you a few current day uplifting examples of the love and compassion that Jesus was teaching. And these all happened within the last several months. In the face of worry over the coronavirus pandemic and all the stress it had placed on New Yorkers, a Brooklyn-based performance artist and English professor, Brandon Wolf, came up with the idea of reviving letter writing as a means to reach out and comfort one another. Knowing that people had lost jobs, loved ones, and businesses, and had given up simple pleasures like hugs from a friend, he wanted to help people make meaningful connections. When interpersonal connection is risky, what are other ways we can be together, he wondered. How about getting a piece of mail in your mailbox from someone you didn't expect to hear from? So using a vintage portable typewriter and seated on a folding chair alongside a mailbox with a sign that read, "Free letters for friends feeling blue," he spent several hours a few days a week for 4 weeks, typing letters for his Brooklyn neighbors and helping them reconnect. When a stressed out mom named Brittany rolled up to a McDonald's drive-thru to purchase a meal for her children, she realized with dismay on making her order that she'd left her purse at home. But the teenage server at the window didn't send her away. Wyatt said he'd happily pay for the meal. Later that night, purse in tow, Brittany drove back to the McDonald's to give Wyatt his money back, but he insisted the meal was on him. Wyatt had shown Brittany such kindness she wanted to find a way to thank him. So on hearing that he was saving up to buy a car, Brittany began a GoFundMe campaign on his behalf. And as of October 1st, she had raised nearly $32,000 for him. Like many elderly Americans, Gloria lives on a limited income. Sometimes that means making hard choices. If money's tight, home repair and maintenance are often the first things to fall by the wayside. But when Gloria's overhead light fixture went out, she decided living in the dark wouldn't do. Though she knew her budget would take a hit, she called in electrician John Kinney to make the necessary repairs. Deeply troubled by the extreme state of disrepair he found in Gloria's house, Kinney couldn't get the woman's desperate situation out of his head. Rather than walk away, Kinney went back to Gloria's place and started working on some other much-needed repairs free of charge. But he didn't stop there. With an impressive chunk of the community rallying to the call to help with repairs, Gloria's home has gotten new electrical and plumbing systems, new windows, and extensive repairs to the crumbling walls, ceilings, front steps, and porch. Meanwhile, outside, as neighbors toiled on landscape cleanup and new planning projects, a steady flow of food donations streamed in to feed the volunteers. Community at work. These are examples of individuals having the experience of being the righteous and being among the least of these, of expressing a very simple and natural love of thy neighbor. This is how we can make a difference in the world. We cannot individually fix all the ills and horrific events that occur so often, but we can, on an individual basis, be the righteous that Christ the King describes. When we do it for the least of these, we do it for him. And perhaps we can realize Pope Pius XI's hope for Christ the King Sunday, and perhaps we can be part of creating a new social structure based on the dignity of every human being. Amen.